The neurologist set down his clipboard, and in that small, careful gesture, Frederick Langdon understood that the most expensive medical team money could assemble had just given up on his daughter. "Mr. Langdon." Dr. Harwick's voice was measured, the kind of measured that came from decades of delivering the same sentence to different families in the same beige consultation room. "Nenah's scans this morning show no meaningful change. At 6 weeks post-aneurysm, the probability of recovery drops significantly with each passing day. I think it's time we discussed next steps." Next steps. Frederick had built Langdon Energy from a one-room office in Calgary into a $3 billion corporation. He had negotiated pipeline contracts with provincial governments, had restructured entire divisions overnight, had never once in 34 years of business encountered a problem that did not have a next step. He stared at the doctor across the table and felt, for the first time in his adult life, that he was being asked to accept the end of something rather than the beginning. "You're telling me to let her go," he said. Dr. Harwick did not flinch. "I'm telling you that continued aggressive intervention may not be in Nenah's best interest. We want to ensure her dignity and comfort." Frederick left without shaking the doctor's hand. He walked past the nurse's station on the 4th floor of Vancouver General, past the family waiting room with its grey upholstered chairs and its mounted television playing a weather forecast nobody was watching, and he kept walking until he found himself in a corridor he did not recognize, somewhere near the hospital's west wing where the walls were painted a softer yellow and children's drawings had been taped along the baseboards. A rabbit. A house with smoke coming from the chimney. A figure labeled "My Mom" in crayon letters that slanted uphill. He stopped walking. He pressed his back against the wall and breathed. Nenah was 15. She played violin. She had her mother's habit of humming while she did homework, and she argued with Frederick about everything from climate policy to which route was faster to the ferry terminal, and she had a laugh that started low before it gathered speed, and she was lying in room 412, connected to machines that breathed for her, while the most respected neurologist in British Columbia suggested it was time to discuss next steps. Frederick closed his eyes. "You look like you've just been told the worst thing in the world." He opened his eyes. A girl was standing a few feet away, watching him with the particular frankness of a child who has not yet learned to look away from other people's pain. She was small, 11, perhaps 12, with dark hair pulled into an uneven braid and a sweater, 2 sizes too large, the cuffs rolled back over her wrists. She carried a textbook under one arm and a granola bar in her free hand, half unwrapped, forgotten. "I'm sorry," Frederick said, because it was the only thing that came out. "My mom's working late," the girl said, as though this explained her presence. "She mops the 4th floor. I wait here sometimes when there's nobody home." She looked at him with steady dark eyes. "Is it your wife?" "My daughter." The girl was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How long has she been asleep?" Frederick looked at her, not out or unconscious or unresponsive, the words the doctors used, asleep. 6 weeks, he said. The girl nodded slowly. "I was asleep for 9. He thought at first that he had misheard her, or that she was speaking in some metaphorical way he didn't follow. But she met his gaze without blinking, without the slight wavering smile of someone who knows they've said something strange. "I had a brain bleed," she said simply. "I was 9 years old. The doctor at the hospital told my mom I would never wake up." She paused. He was wrong. Frederick's chest did something complicated. He had spent 6 weeks flying in specialists from Toronto, from Montreal, from a clinic in Geneva that cost more per consultation than most people earned in a year. He had funded research. He had called in every favor his name and his money could generate. And now a child in an oversized sweater was standing in a hospital corridor, telling him a doctor had been wrong about her. "What's your name?" he asked. "Nola," she said, "Nola Tremblay." Her mother's name was Celeste, and she arrived at 8:15 pushing a wheeled mop bucket, still wearing her work uniform, her braid, the same braid as Nola's, Frederick noticed, coming loose at the nape of her neck. She stopped when she saw her daughter sitting across from a man in a suit she probably recognized from the hospital's donor plaques. "Nola," her voice was careful, "are you bothering this gentleman?" "She isn't," Frederick said immediately. He stood. "My name is Frederick Langdon. Your daughter and I were just talking." He hesitated. "She told me about her illness, 3 years ago. Celeste's expression shifted, not closed off exactly, but cautious in the way of someone who had learned that certain conversations came with costs. She did. I have a daughter upstairs. The neurologist this morning recommended withdrawing support. He said it plainly, because plainness was all he had left. I don't have anywhere else to go. Celeste looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Nenah, who gave a small nod that seemed to carry more information than it should have. Something passed between mother and daughter, the private language of people who had been through something together that others hadn't. "Come," Celeste said finally. "We'll find somewhere to sit and I'll tell you what I can." They sat in the family waiting room with its gray chairs, and Celeste told him. Her grandmother had been a healer in her Métis community in northern Manitoba, and her mother after her. Not doctors, not anything that would be written up in a journal, but women who had spent decades learning how the body speaks when it cannot use words. When Nenah had her aneurysm at 9, and the hospital in Winnipeg transferred her here, when the neurologist, a different man, but Frederick would later understand they had all trained in the same tradition of certainty, had pulled Celeste aside and used the phrase consistent with permanent vegetative state. Celeste had not cried. She had gone home, called her grandmother in Thompson, and asked her what to do. She came back the next day with a bag. She sang to Nenah. Specific songs, not lullabies, but the songs that Nenah had loved, the ones she hummed doing her homework, the ones that played on the radio during their drives to school. She brought Nola's favorite wool blanket from home and laid it across her feet. She brought a small cedar sachet that Nenah had kept under her pillow and placed it near her pillow in the hospital. She pressed her thumbs in slow circles into the center of Nola's palms every morning and every evening, a technique her grandmother had described in terms that didn't translate well into English. Something about pathways and attention, about telling the body that someone was still waiting for it on the other side. She talked to her daughter constantly, about everything and nothing, treating every silence as a conversation she was simply carrying both halves of. The doctors tolerated it. One nurse, a woman named Anita, encouraged it quietly. On the 43rd day, Nenah squeezed her mother's hand. Frederick listened to all of it without interrupting. Then he said, "Why isn't this in the medical literature? If Nenah recovered." They said it was a misdiagnosis. Celeste's voice was even, but Frederick heard the old anger underneath it. "Dr. Harwick, yes, the same Dr. Harwick. He was one of the consulting specialists." When Nenah woke up, he said the original diagnosis must have been wrong, that she had never truly been what they thought. He was not interested in what I had done. He was not interested in documenting it. She paused. "I am a hospital custodian, Mr. Langdon. I didn't have the means to argue with him." The name hit him like cold water. The same doctor, the same man who had stood across a table from him today and recommended next steps. "I'd like to try," Celeste said quietly. "If you'll allow it, I make no promises. I told Nenah she could not promise you anything either, but I can come each day. I can show the nurses what I do. I can explain it as best I can in words they'll accept, and I can try." Frederick was a man who had made his fortune by calculating risk. He knew that what Celeste was describing had no peer-reviewed evidence behind it, no clinical trial, no mechanism of action he could present to his board or his lawyers. He knew that Dr. Harwick would object, that the hospital administration would raise questions, that the sensible thing, the thing every rational voice in him insisted on, was to go back to that consultation room and discuss next steps. He thought about Nina's laugh, how it started low before it gathered speed. "When can you start?" he asked. Dr. Harwick objected. He used words like protocol and liability and unqualified practitioner, and Frederick listened to all of it with the stillness of a man who has already made his decision and is simply waiting for the objection to exhaust itself. "She works here," Frederick said when Harwick finished. "She knows this building. She will be doing nothing that interferes with Nina's medical care. She will be present during permitted visiting hours. She will not touch any equipment, and she will have my full legal authorization as Nina's father. If you want to discuss this further, you can speak with my lawyers." It was not a negotiation. Harwick understood this. The younger neurologist on Nina's team, Dr. Yoon, was less certain of certainty than Harwick. She had graduated 7 years ago and had spent enough time in ICU rooms to know that she did not know everything. When Frederick explained the situation, she listened without interrupting, asked 3 careful questions about what Celeste intended to do, and then said she would document every session and monitor Nenah's responses. "If there's anything to find," she said quietly, "I want to find it." Celeste came the next morning with her bag. Nola came after school. The first thing Celeste did was open the window blinds. They had been kept half closed, and she said quietly, without accusation, that light mattered. She asked Frederick what music Nenah loved. He had to think about it. They had argued about so much, the two of them, and he had not always paid attention to the right things. But he remembered her playing a particular playlist on Saturday mornings when she practiced, something that moved between classical pieces and songs from the radio, and he pulled it up on his phone and let it play softly from the speaker on the window ledge. Celeste placed a photograph of Nenah's cat, a gray tabby named Biscuit, who was currently staying with Frederick's assistant, on the table beside the bed. She brought the violet wool scarf Nenah had worn every winter since she was 12, the one with the small tear near the fringe that Nenah had never let anyone repair, because she said it gave it character, and she draped it over Nenah's feet beneath the hospital blanket. Then she sat beside the bed, took Nenah's hand and began to talk to her. Not to the room, not in the careful, slightly too loud way that people sometimes spoke to those who could not answer. She talked to Nenah specifically, personally, as though Nenah were simply sitting with her eyes closed and might open them at any moment. "Your dad is here," she said. "He hasn't left, not for more than a few hours at a time. He brings terrible coffee from the machine in the hallway, and he drinks it standing up because he can't quite bring himself to sit. He looks like a man who is learning something he should have learned a long time ago, and I think he knows it." Frederick, standing by the window, said nothing. His throat was too tight for words. Nola came at 4 o'clock with her backpack, did her homework in the corner chair, and then moved to the foot of Nenah's bed. She talked to Nenah the way she had talked to Frederick in the hallway, direct, unhurried, a child who had decided that honesty was the most useful thing she had to offer. "I know what it's like in there," she said. "It's not nothing. It's not darkness. I remember pieces of it, my mom's voice, mostly, and the music she played, and the feeling of her hands." She paused. "You don't have to find your way back all at once. Just listen for the things you love. They're still there." The days passed. Celeste came every morning. She used her thumbs on the centers of Nenah's palms, slow, patient circles, and worked her way along specific points at the base of Nenah's fingers, along her wrists, at the soles of her feet. She explained each thing to Dr. Yoon as she did it quietly in the language she had, not scientific language, but precise in its own way. Dr. Yoon wrote it all down. Frederick spent most of each day in the room. He had handed the day-to-day operations of Langdon Energy to his VP without a clear timeline for return. He talked to Nenah about the things he had always meant to talk about and hadn't. The fact that he had missed her spring recital 2 years ago because of a board meeting in Edmonton and had told himself he'd make up for it, and hadn't made up for it. The way she had her mother's laugh, her mother who had died when Nenah was 7, and whom Frederick had not talked about enough, because grief had made him clumsy in the way that grief makes some people clumsy. He told her about Biscuit, who had apparently knocked his assistant's plant off 3 consecutive windowsills. He told her about the October light on the harbor, which was something she had always loved to paint. On the 9th day, he was sitting with Nenah's hand in his, talking about nothing in particular, when he felt it, a pressure against his fingers. Faint, unmistakable. He stopped breathing. "Nenah," he said. His voice came out too quiet. He made himself steady it. "Nenah, can you hear me? If you can, squeeze my hand again." The room held its breath. And then, with the effort of someone lifting something very heavy from very far away, Nenah's fingers curled against his. He pressed the call button with his free hand and did not let go of hers. Dr. Yoon arrived first. She ran the assessment quickly, professionally, but her hands weren't quite as steady as usual, and when she checked Nenah's pupillary response and saw what she saw, she was quiet for a moment before she spoke. "There is increased response in both motor and sensory testing," she said carefully. This is not what the scans predicted." She looked at Frederick. "I need to run a new EEG. Tonight if possible." Celeste arrived 20 minutes later, and stood in the doorway, reading the room before she entered. She looked at Frederick's face and understood. She sat beside Nenah without being asked and placed her hand over Nenah's very gently. "You found it," she said softly. "Whatever you were listening for, you found it." Dr. Harwick came at the end of the week, summoned by the results of the EEG that Dr. Yoon had sent to 3 external neurologists for independent review. He stood at the foot of Nenah's bed and looked at the new scans and said nothing for a long time. Then he said, as Frederick had known he would, that spontaneous neurological improvement did occur in a small percentage of severe aneurysm cases, that the timing was coincidental, that Miss Tremblay's presence in the room, while not objectionable, could not be credited with clinical significance. 3 neurologists have reviewed Nenah's new scans, Frederick said. All 3 described the pattern of improvement as inconsistent with known spontaneous recovery timelines. He looked at Harwick steadily. "You reviewed Nola Tremblay's case 3 years ago and revised her diagnosis to explain away her recovery. I have her original records, which I obtained with her mother's full consent. 3 independent specialists have reviewed them as well. The original diagnosis of severe hypoxic brain injury was correct." Harwick said nothing. "You had a patient who recovered from an incurable condition," Frederick said, "and you buried it, because acknowledging it would have required you to take seriously something you had already decided was beneath consideration. What is it you want, Mr. Langdon?" It was not entirely a question. Frederick thought about it. A year ago, he would have wanted something the size of his anger, something that would reduce Harwick to the scale of the damage he had caused. Now, with Nenah's fingers growing stronger by the day, and Nola doing homework in the corner chair, and Celeste singing something low and quiet in her language beside the bed, his anger had changed shape. It had become something more purposeful. "I want you to submit Nola's case to the journal where you sit on the editorial board," he said, "written up correctly, with the original diagnosis intact. I want you to co-author it with Dr. Yoon, and I want the methodology, Celeste Tremblay's methodology, described in full, with the same rigor you would give to any other intervention." He paused. "And I want you to tell me whether you are capable of approaching this with genuine scientific curiosity, or whether I should find someone else to do it." The silence stretched. "I am a scientist," Harwick said finally. The words came out more quietly than he had probably intended. "Then act like one," Frederick said. Nenah said his name on a Tuesday morning in November, 3 weeks after her fingers first moved. It came out as a breath more than a word, half-syllable, all intention, and Frederick, who had been telling her about the way the ice had started to form along the inlet that morning, stopped mid-sentence. "Dad," she said again, barely there, present. He leaned forward and took her hand and could not speak for a long moment. Outside the window, the gray Vancouver sky was doing what it always did in November, and none of it mattered at all. "I'm here, sweetheart," he managed. "I'm right here." Her eyes opened slowly. Not all at once, not like a film, but in stages, as though light was something that had to be relearned. She looked at the ceiling. Then she turned her head very slightly and looked at him. "You look terrible," she said so quietly it was barely sound. He laughed. It came out broken at the edges, but it was real, and it was the first time he had laughed in 6 weeks, and she closed her eyes again with the ghost of something that might have been satisfaction. Celeste was in the hallway. He found her when he finally trusted himself to stand, and she read his face before he could find the words. She pressed both his hands between hers and said nothing, which was the only thing there was to say. Nola looked up from her chair in the corner. "She woke up?" "She woke up," Frederick said. Nola nodded, with the matter-of-fact certainty of someone whose hypothesis had just been confirmed. "Good," she said, and went back to her homework. The Langdon Integrative Healing Foundation was announced the following spring, on a bright April morning with the mountains still snow-capped behind the Vancouver skyline. Frederick had spent the winter working on it with the same focus he had once given to pipelines and quarterly earnings, and he had found, to his surprise, that it required the same skills. The ability to see what others had decided wasn't worth seeing, and to fund it anyway. The foundation was built on a simple premise, that healing happened in the space between what medicine could explain and what it could not, and that the only rational response to that space was not dismissal, but curiosity. It brought together neurologists and traditional healers, researchers and practitioners, in a framework that required neither side to abandon its language, only to listen to the others. Celeste Tremblay was its first director of integrative practice. The salary allowed her to stop working the night shift. Nenah transferred to a school closer to their new apartment and joined the science club, where she spent most of her time trying to explain to her teacher why the club should be studying ethnobotany alongside chemistry. Dr. Yoon joined the Foundation's research team. Dr. Harwick, after a period of significant professional discomfort, submitted the co-authored paper with his name third on the author list, where he had insisted it be placed. Frederick did not argue. The paper described 2 cases of severe hypoxic neurological injury with documented recovery following integrative intervention. It described Celeste's methods in enough detail that other practitioners could attempt to replicate them. It noted that the mechanism of action remained incompletely understood and that further research was urgently warranted. It was not celebrated universally. Several commenters in the journal's letters section described it as methodologically suspect. Several others described it as the most important case series published in the neurological literature in a decade. Frederick kept both responses on his desk. He thought they were both probably right. Nenah came to the Foundation's opening. She walked in on her own, slowly, one hand lightly on her father's arm. Not for balance, mostly, she said, but because she wanted to, and she had decided to stop explaining the things she wanted to do. She was thinner than she had been, and there were days when the words came slower than she wanted them to, and the violin was something she was working back to in pieces, but she was there. She was present. She looked at the room full of doctors and healers and researchers and parents who had been told nothing could be done, and she understood why she was standing in it. Nenah was near the back, eating from a plate of appetizers with the focused efficiency of a 12-year-old, who has assessed the table and found the best items. She caught Nenah's eye across the room and raised her juice glass in a small, solemn toast. Nenah raised hers back. Later, when most of the crowd had gone and the caterers were folding up the white tablecloths, Nenah found a chair beside Nenah near the window that looked out over the harbor. They sat for a while without talking, which had become one of their comfortable things. Neither of them felt compelled to fill a silence, possibly because both of them had spent a long time in a silence that nobody else could hear. "My teacher says I should be a doctor," Nenah said eventually. "What do you want to be?" Nenah asked. Nenah thought about it with the seriousness she brought to most things. "I want to understand how people come back," she said, "from the places nobody thinks they can come back from." She paused. "There should be someone who studies that." "There should," Nenah agreed. Across the room, Frederick stood with Celeste, looking out at the water. The April light was thin and clean, the kind that makes Vancouver look like a place that could not possibly contain sorrow, and they both knew well enough to understand that wasn't true, and chose to look at it anyway. "Thank you," he said. He had said it before, many times, and each time it had meant something slightly different. Tonight it meant everything. Celeste shook her head. "Thank Nenah," she said. "She did the hard part, the part none of us could do for her." He nodded. He knew this was true. He had known it since November, standing in room 412 with his daughter's hand in his, learning, too late and just in time, that some things could not be purchased or negotiated or solved, that some things required only the one thing he had almost failed to give: the refusal to stop believing she could find her way back. The harbor caught the last of the light. Somewhere near the window, Nenah laughed, low first, then gathering speed.